When we think of major international tournaments, the World Cup, the Euros, we think Germany. Since the post-war era, the Germans have been part of the furniture of global football. From the miracle at Bern to 7-1, we think Germany. It's sort of impossible to think about a major international tournament without the Germans. And right, when we say the Germans, we really also mean to the West Germans, the German Federal Republic that was established in 1949. Those are the teams, both internationally but also at club level, right? Bayern Munich, etc., that we remember. We don't really think about East Germany when we think about major international tournaments. When we think about East Germany, we think about the Stasi, we think about the Wall, we think about, really bizarre plastic cars. We don't think international football. And, for most of us listening or watching, you'd probably say, well, these Shermans were never there. But there you'd be wrong. What if I told you that 50 years ago, on June the 22nd, 1974, in Hamburg, East and West Germany met in a World Cup group stage match, which ended 1-0 to the Aussies? Welcome to the Too Many Guys Soccer Show. This is Professor Matt, and this is the first of a series of longer historically based episodes in preparation for the upcoming Euros, which will be held in Germany. And indeed, a few of the matches will be held in what was the former East Germany at the, Red Bull Arena in Leipzig. And so I figured I'd start off this series, and there's going to be at least three of these. There might be a fourth. I haven't made up my mind yet. Uh, there's also going to be at least one or two that are going to be Copa America related, so they'll be coming out as the summer emerges. Dealing with some facet of one of the teams, that will be in these tournaments. And so I figured, we'll kick it off with a examination of the two Germanys, right? Because we have to remember, for 40 years, there were two Germanys, and there were two German national teams, and there were two German league systems. Uh, and when we think about German football, right, we're talking about West German football. And there's a reason for that. The West Germans were extremely successful. I mean, the Civil War speaks for itself. And I would argue, too, that success, on the pitch, both the national team, but also at the club level, those Bayern teams of the 1970s, were in some ways an integral part in reinventing German national identity and the package or the brand of sort of post-war Germany, right? By the 19 late 70s, by the 1980s, most people when they thought about Germany, their reference wasn't really the war anymore. It was Volkswagen, it was beer, and it was Bayern Munich and the German national team, the West German national team. We don't really talk about the other side of the equation. And again, the East Germans only made it to one real major tournament, one World Cup, 1974. But it's a story that's worth talking about and worth remembering, especially again considering, look, there's going to be matches played in what was East Germany just in a month or so. And this is not East Germany's first rodeo in terms of a major international tournament. There were some matches held in Leipzig back in 2006 when United Germany hosted the World Cup. Uh, but the East Germans, they were there. And they too had their own sort of weird little golden generation, or really golden generations. More about that in a second. Uh, during the 70s and then towards the end, in the late 80s. So, how do you get Germany, two Germanys? Well, I mean, the answer to that is really simple. The Germans lose, they're 0 for 2 in world wars, and Hitler effed up. And right, so in 1945, Germany surrenders. There's there's really four, right? There's an American, British, French, and Soviet. But there's really two occupation zones. There's the Western occupation zone and the Eastern occupation zone administered by the Soviet Union. Like everything in Germany, the end of the war meant the end of football. Uh, but pretty soon, within less than a year, organized club football, not professional, but organized club football in some form, reemerges in, all of the various occupation zones. And right, it's happening in the West, but it's also happening in the Soviet zone, where you have, a lot of pre-war clubs are, no longer exist, but smaller amateur clubs, including one managed by Helmut Schön, who eventually would go on to manage the West German teams, including the West German team that met the East German team in 1974. Right, because he was a native of Saxony. And so he managed a small club in Dresden under the Soviet occupation in the late 40s until he dipped to the West in 1949 or 1950. Uh, so football emerges or reemerges pretty much as soon as the hostilities are over. But you have these two occupation zones. And, this is important. Neither the Western Allies or the Soviets really had a grand scheme of how to rebuild or reconstruct a defeated Germany. Right, there was not really going to be an intention for a East or a West Germany, two independent entities existing. Right. There's some talk by the big allies at Potsdam and before that at Yalta about what to do with the defeated Germany, and that's how you get the occupation zones. But there's no grand plan. And so in many cases, local military occupation authorities are literally winging it on the ground. And then by the time you get to 1946, 1947, there's not really a discussion between the Western Allies and the Soviets because the Cold War has kind of set in. And so the Western Allies, but also the Soviets, start rebuilding their occupation zones in their own image. So, in the American occupation zone, you effectively get, a version of the New Deal just imported into Germany. Uh, in the case of the Soviet zone, it's similar. It's Stalinist economics, it's Soviet institutions, and this also meant football, right? Football in what would become East Germany is effectively crafted in the image of the Soviet Union. So, the big clubs you have, right, Dynamos, secret police, in this case, the Stasi clubs. You have locomotives, right? You have an army team based out of Berlin. You have a lot of optics, right? You have a lot of factory clubs. So in 1949, West Germany is declared an independent state. Literally within a couple weeks, East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, or the Deutschen Demokratischen Republik, the DDR, are proclaimed as independent countries. And within literally a year, both of them have their own separate football league pyramids. In West Germany will eventually become the Bundesliga. In East Germany, it's the Oberliga and the top league, effectively. And right, they also are preparing the formation of their own national teams. So you have two separate, by 1949, you have two Germanys that are built and constructed really in the image of, the occupiers. West Germany is a fabrication of the capitalist East Germany is a fabrication of, the, state-driven socialist project of the Soviet Union. And right, their football mirrors that as well. Uh, the East German national team is birthed about a year after independence, and it applies for FIFA and UEFA membership, and in 1951 is granted both. So FIFA and UEFA acknowledged the existence of two Germanys before either of these Germanys and a lot of other places do so. Uh, the reason the East Germans are able to do this is because the Soviets and, their fellow sort of people's democracies like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary were already FIFA members. So, they were able to vote them in. The first international, match played by the East Germans is in February 1952, and it's a 3-0 defeat at the hands of Poland in Warsaw. The first home match is a 0-0 draw a couple months later to Bulgaria in East Berlin. East German football, both in terms of international and at the club level, kind of operates weirdly in a vacuum for the first decade or so. And there's reasons beyond sport for that. The vast majority of East Germany's early matches are, with fellow socialist states, so the Soviet Union, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, uh, North Korea and Mongolia, etc. They don't really play teams or nations from outside the socialist bloc, and there's a reason for this. Both of these new Germanys reject the legitimacy of the other in the first 20 years or so, right? And the West Germans make this explicit. In 1955, the West German government produces this thing called the Hallstein Doctrine, which quite literally delegitimizes, in this sort of doctrine, they claim to be the sole legitimate Germany. So East Germany might as well not exist. And this is the kicker, West Germany would not do business with any nation that recognized East Germany. So all of Western Europe, the United States, Japan, and a lot of initially the decolonizing world, these newly independent states emerging from Western imperialism in Asia and Africa. Look, West Germany by the mid-50s is already an economic powerhouse. Trading with West Germany and potentially getting economic aid made sense. So, in a very real way, the vast majority of the world did not recognize East Germany's existence. And even though they were members of FIFA or UEFA, if you don't recognize a country's right to exist or, literally its existence, you're not going to schedule friendlies or anything with them. So, for like the first chunk of East Germany's existence, their national team is effectively playing just the Soviets, just the fellow, socialist states in Eastern Central Europe. Again, the People's Republic of China, Mongolia, etc. But like they're not really in global football because the West Germans have sort of blocked them. And to be fair, too, the East Germans denied the legitimacy of West Germany, right? So the first decade or so of East German football, they're hamstrung by this. They're in a very real way kind of isolated or incubated. And right in 1954, a World Cup's coming up. The West Germans, who win the damn thing. This is the miracle at Bern where they beat the magical Magyars. More about that in another video. The East German FA didn't even bother, even though they were FIFA members, to qualify. Right? In fact, it never. You read documents from this period, and it never occurred to them to actually enter the team for a major international tournament, right? And so, in the summer of 1954, West Germany. And again, this is less than 10 years after the war. And both West and East Germany are still in a lot of ways trying to figure out what the fuck they are, right? What does it mean to be West German? What does it mean to be East German? What does it mean to be German post-Nazi? Right? So, we have this notion that, the Iron Curtain was indeed an Iron Curtain. Okay, so once the Berlin Wall comes up, which is until the early 60s, yeah, there are checkpoints and stuff, but people in Berlin, let's say, which is literally a divided city, went from west to east to work, to visit relatives. The U-Bahn, the subway, went to both east and west. There was movement, right? And East German radio broadcast the matches of from the 1954 World Cup. So, it wasn't like the East German population was shielded for what was going on. And again, the notion that there is a separate East versus a West and vice versa kind of really didn't exist. The West Germans win, and ordinary East Germans, much to the horror and dismay of the regime, have block parties. They have barbecues. It's a celebration. It's a party. Germany's won the World Cup. The problem is at least in the eyes of the regime, it's the wrong Germany that won the World Cup. And God damn it, we should have been there. We screwed up. So, in the wake of this popular euphoria amongst ordinary East Germans, which the regime really couldn't control, the East German state starts to get involved with football. And, a couple things emerge. First of all, this is now very clearly being driven by Cold War rivalry. If you claim you're the real Germany and the not real Germany just won the World Cup, you have a freaking problem. And right in the case of the East German regime, the regular East Germans celebrated the victory of West Germany in 1954. So, like, we need to get our ass together. We have to get our act together. So, it's in the wake of the miracle at Bern that the East German regime starts to really put resources into domestic football. The Oberliga, which had existed already, gets professionalized, right? And a lot of emphasis and a lot of resources are placed into youth development, right? Because this is an era really before, big international transfers anyway. But particularly if you're a country like East Germany, where a lot of the world doesn't recognize your existence, uh, economically speaking, you can't go and buy players because, you're technically a socialist state. You're going to need really good youth academies to bring up and bludgeon in homegrown talent, not just for the domestic league, but ultimately for the national. So there's this wholesale reshuffle reform of the East German football uh, pyramid. And beginning in the late 50s, even though they're having problems scheduling, friendlies with anybody but, Bulgaria, like no one really wants to play you, the East Germans attempt to enter and qualify major international tournaments. From 1958 to 1964, these attempts are failures. But you have to put this into context too. They're kind of doing this from scratch, right? And so this is this sort of period where they're just kind of figuring stuff out. Now, it should be mentioned, West Germany, who did win in 1954, after the miracle at Bern, and really until 1966 when they lose to England in that final, these are kind of lean years for them. They too are building. And they're going to build ultimately a golden generation that would include the likes of Gerd Mueller, Heinkes, Beckenbauer, Sepp Maier, etc. But it takes them some time to get these guys in and through too. And right, the Bundesliga, West German football isn't fully professionalized yet either. So both Germanys are kind of, professionalizing, modernizing, getting their football, in order, but they're doing it, in different ways, but they're doing it simultaneously. And right in the back of both, the regime in Bonn and the regime in East Berlin's mind, there is also this Cold War rivalry, because hey, we're the real Germany, and we have to make sure that the other Germany doesn't, you know what I mean? So by the mid 60s, the West Germans, that core that will go on to really sort of dominate European football after 1968 into the early 70s, uh, it's emerging. But the reforms in the East are also starting to take hold, particularly the youth development. And right, the quality of the domestic game in the Oberliga really starts to get better. The second half of the 60s and into the 70s are really the golden era of that league. And right, you start to see a core of young players emerging, particularly from two clubs, Dynamo Dresden and FC Magdeburg. And this is, in a real way, kind of East Germany's own golden generation. Were they as talented as the West Germans? Hard to say. I mean, the West Germans obviously won more stuff, but this is a pretty good team. Forwards like Joachim Streich, Edhard Vogel, Peter Doike, Martin Hoffmann, fullbacks, uh, Hans-Jürgen Dixie Donner, who probably is the face of this East German national team. Goalkeeper Jürgen Kroy, who was I think criminally underrated. Fullbacks Konrad Weiss, Bernard Brache, Lothar Korberweit, and a midfield of guys like Wolfgang Segun, Reinhard Locke, and Jürgen Spanswasser. They also get a manager in Georg Buschner, who, had come up through the ranks and, was a youth manager, also managed at club level. And so he kind of, monitored all of these guys' development. And, speaking of the World Cup in 1966, the East Germans come damn close to qualifying. Uh, they finished second in their group. And right, there's a crisis because, the World Cup's to be held in England. The British government does not recognize East Germany's existence, right? Holstein Doctrine. So you can go to the archives of the British Foreign Ministry and there's panic in the air because they're like, oh my God, the Germans we don't recognize might qualify for a tournament in our country. How the hell are we going to do this, right? And in fact, that nightmare scenario comes true because the Korea that they don't recognize. Maybe I'll do a video about this at some point. The North Koreans qualified that tournament, and it's a diplomatic nightmare for the British because they have to explain to the South Koreans, we have to have them here because they qualified on merit, and what do we do by hosting a country in our country for a major international tournament that we don't recognize their right to exist? So they come close in 1966. They also finished second in their group in 1970. So some near misses there. Near misses in the Euros too. 1968. If it was an expanded field, right? This is when the Euros were only 8 teams. If this was 16 teams, East Germany would have qualified directly, both in 1968 and 1972. But the East Germans do show up to tournaments during this period of near misses. The Olympics, right? Because the Olympics, technically, it's for amateur athletes. But in the socialist bloc, as we know, particularly those who are fans of hockey, what it meant to be social amateur versus professional, it really wasn't a distinction. Everyone was technically an amateur. So the Soviets, when they played hockey or basketball, they were busting out their dream team well before the United States or any Western country could. And the same thing applied in football. If you look at the Olympic football in the 60s and in the 70s and the early 80s, it is dominated by Central and Eastern European teams. Why? Because they're fielding their goddamn national teams, right, versus everybody else's amateurs or under 21s. Uh, so the East Germans show up to the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo. They get third place. In 1972, in the Olympics held in West Germany. Whoa, this is whoa. They also finished third and en route defeat West Germany's under 21s, granted 3-2. How the hell are the East Germans playing West Germany in a German Olympics in 1972? Right, because we already talked about this. In 1966, the West German government and the British government are crapping their pants at the thought of the East Germans potentially qualifying for the World Cup because, they don't talk to one another. By the early 70s, things have changed, and they've changed in both East and West. So in West Germany, beginning with the election in 1968 of a coalition government that included both Christian Democrats. And remember, the Christian Democrats, the party of Konrad Adenauer, they're the ones who pushed the Holstein Doctrine. And the Social Democrats. And then 2 years later, when you have a majority Social Democratic government under the chancellorship of Willy Brandt, West Germany launches its own version of what will be called détente, an outreach beyond the socialist bloc and the normalization of relations with these countries and the easing of Cold War tensions. In the West German context, it is called Ostpolitik. And this is where Willy Brandt acknowledges the realities of the post-war situation. Remember, Poland is, well, it's shrunk because, well, Eastern Poland, Western Belarus, Western Ukraine, however you want to frame it, goes over to the Soviet Union. That territory the Soviets got from the Nazi, the Stalin, Hitler or Molotov, Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. But Poland is compensated with land in the West that's formerly Germany. The West German government never recognized that. They claim that like a third of Poland was actually Germany, even though there were no goddamn Germans there, because they were ethnically cleansed at the end of the war. Willy Brandt, and therefore West Germany and Poland had no diplomatic relations. Beginning in the late 60s, they start feeling each other out. And then Willy Brandt makes, that famous visit to Warsaw, where he just collapses in front of the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto, apologizes for, what Germany did during the war, and says, look, we recognize these new borders, we renounce any claims to Polish territory. The borders of post-war Poland are the borders of Poland. The borders of post-war Germany are the borders of Germany. And that was a huge deal, huge deal. He goes up to Moscow, chills with Brezhnev. They go hunting. They sign, trade agreements. Poland, Soviet Union, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia get huge loans from, financial institutions from the West, including Deutsche Bank. But this Ostpolitik also extends to East Germany. And Brandt, not just recognizing the realities of, post-war borders vis-a-vis Poland, also wants to do the same in regards to East Germany. In East Germany, something else is also happening too that's going to allow for them to, reach accommodation with their Western brethren. In the late 60s, in 1967, 68, two rather important things happen. One is the Six-Day War in the Middle East. And right, Arab states, but also a lot of the decolonizing world. So sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of countries in Latin America, East Asia, break diplomatic relations with Israel. These states, including ones that were relatively pro-Soviet, like Nasser's Egypt or Syria, they still didn't recognize East Germany because they were doing business with West Germany. And look, it's good to do business with West Germany. Uh, they really, really get a sick, disgusting taste in their mouth because, they ask the West Germans, hey, you have to, you have really good relations with Israel because of stuff. You have to tell them to get the hell out of our land, like end the occupation. And the West Germans effectively tell the Arabs and, Africans, this opens up a door because almost immediately Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Zaire, Ethiopia, include, sort of pro-socialist Latin, third world countries, but also ones that were vehemently anti-communist, like Mobutu in Zaire, recognize East Germany. Why? Because East Germany, from jump, was on board with the Palestinian and the larger Arab and, dare I say, decolonizing causes. So all of a sudden, East Germany, that was playing, Mongolia and the Soviet Union because there was only places they could play, or all of a sudden scheduling friendlies with all of these countries because all of a sudden these countries recognize the right to exist and they're like, yo, send your team down, we'll play, etc. So there's this outreach, this East German outreach into the third world, which is a fascinating topic and part of, uh, my master's thesis, but that's a story for a different day, perhaps. You also have a shift in the leadership in East Germany. And it's weird because, for most people that know anything about East Germany, they know Erich Honecker, who was the last leader of the country. And they remember him towards the end of the 80s as this old kind of conservative neo-Stalinist guy. What people forget, though, is actually when Erich Honecker comes in 1970 and replaces Walter Ulbricht, Honecker was seen as a reformer. And indeed, Ulbricht gets removed, Honecker gets in, and Honecker launches a kind of sort of soft liberalization policy. Right, oppression, open, outright repression is curbed to an extent. To an extent. Right. All of a sudden, artists can do certain things. So anyone who knows anything about East German film, also a big part of my master's thesis. Uh, the 1970s, the early 70s, the early to mid 70s are the golden era of East German filmmaking. Some of the most remarkable films that come out of East Germany come out of that era. Things like the original Jacob the Liar, not the shit, but Robin Williams, the good one, the East German one. This great, crazy sci-fi film called In the Dust of the Stars. All of these crazy movies that just a couple years later would never have seen the light of day because the censors would have killed it. And then, in the late 70s, early 80s, definitely wouldn't have gotten made. Or all of a sudden out there. And right, there's a much higher urgency, or should I say, there's a greater emphasis placed on consumer goods, including consumer goods from the West. This is when East German kids can listen to the Beatles, although like I have an LP, I have the East German pressing of Sergeant Pepper, and there's like 4 tracks that are mysteriously gone. So you couldn't listen to everything, but you could at least listen to them now. And right, a big part of this was securing Western capital, hard cash, trade cash homie, uh, to help the economy, particularly the consumer base of the economy. And by doing so, that would necessitate easing Cold War tensions, getting recognized or trying to get recognized by, not just in this case, third world countries, but by Western countries. And particularly, right, if you want to, enter the market that is the EU, that means you have talked to the West Germans, you've talked to the other Germans. And so in both the West and the East, in the late 60s and the early 70s, there's this coming together, right? You have Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik in the West. You have Erich Honecker and this outreach to the wider world and this kind of like sort of semi-liberalization coming together. And in 1972, right before the Olympics, both Germanys sign what is called the Basic Treaty. And the Basic Treaty pretty much states the following: both Germanys relinquish their claim to each other. So neither West nor East Germany is claiming to be the only Germany anymore. And they agree to formally establish diplomatic relations with one another and recognize each other's sovereignty. The following year, East Germany is finally admitted into the United Nations, right, which they were barred from because most of the UN and Holstein Doctrine recognized West Germany, so they were shut out. And in 1973, the East German Constitution is reformed, and indeed, the first paragraph explicitly states we are a separate socialist German state. So there's this other Germany that isn't us, and we are this special, new, unique, separate socialist Germany. So when the East Germans show up to Munich in 1972 and beat the West Germans in the Olympics, things have been pieced up like to a point. Yeah, there's two separate countries. Yes, there's still a Cold War divide, but détente is the order of the day. And, the ability of a East German team to not just play a West German team, but to play a West German team in West Germany is now possible. And that's a good thing because in 1973, just when East Germany is admitted to the UN, the constitutions changed. Both countries have agreed to recognize one another the year before. The East Germans finally do it. They finish first in their World Cup qualifying group, and they will be sending a team and a qualifying group that included a pretty good Romania team, by the way. They will be sending a team to the World Cup that will be hosted in West Germany. And things get crazier. So when they do the group draw, West Germany's obviously plopped into pot A, so they're going to be in Group A. In Group A, they get Australia. Okay. They get Chile, pretty good Chilean team, by the way. And they get the East Germans. So both Germanys are in each other's group and they're going to have to play each other in the group stage. This would have been unthinkable, improbable, just 6, 7 years earlier. Go back to 1966. The British government's crapping themselves because, oh my God, if the East Germans qualify, what the hell do we tell the West Germans? What do we do? 1974, East Germany qualifies for a major international tournament in West Germany. They're in the same group as West Germany. And it's kind of chill, but it's still the Cold War. And both the West German golden generation and this East German golden generation and the politicians and the FAs all have that last group game match in Hamburg circled because football is never just a game. We've a recurring theme on this podcast, and particularly when I'm on, it's always political. And in this case, it was explicitly political. And the stakes were rather high because even though both Germanys now recognize each other, detente has broken out, it's still a contest of systems and ideologies and worldviews. Both Germanys now recognize their right to be a separate Germany. But who's going to be the best Germany, right? Because the Germany that wins on the football pitch, it means that their system, their ideology, their institutions win. So if West Germany wins, capitalism wins. The West wins. If East Germany wins, check that off as a victory for socialism, and especially for the East Germans, right? Because they're really in a very real way they're entering the world system, or the international community, right? And so East German football defeating West German football on global television, right? You have satellite TV at this point. That's a commercial for your system and for your regime, particularly again for places like the third world where, hey, if the Angolan government wants, foreign specialists to set up their own national team, or their own league because the Portuguese have dipped, uh, maybe we'll call the East Germans up. They seem to do it, and it's not just football specialists, economic specialists, it's you name it. So the group matches look like this. Now, remember, this is the World Cup before the quote unquote round of 16. So there's the first set of group stages, and then there's that second stage, and then you'd have the quarterfinals. So the top two teams would advance and then get regrouped. So West Germany defeats Chile in a tight 1-0 in the opener. The GDR, the East Germans, wallop Australia 2-0. And in preparation for this, you can go to YouTube and actually watch these. I actually rewatched all three of the group stage, the East German group stage matches. That match easily could have ended 4-5-0 to East Germany. The West Germans do one better against Australia in the following match and smack them up 3-0. Chile and the East Germans draw 1-1, a tight match. And then, incredibly enough, right, because this is before Germans and Austrians did some shady stuff, and the last group stage matches were simultaneous. So the last group stage match was literally the last group stage match. A match would be played. They weren't simultaneous. So the East Germans and the West Germans knew the result of Chile and Australia. And incredibly enough, the Chileans, they dropped the bag, and that match ends 0-0. So both West Germany and East Germany are primed. They know they're going to advance, but who's going to win the group? Because this match all of a sudden becomes for all the marbles, right? And so the two teams meet in Hamburg on June the 22nd, 1974. And it should be noted, shame on me, I should mention this. I do have it down in my notes. So this being Germany's first major international tournament, because you get the Olympics, but the Olympics, it's different. Who's in the crowd supporting East Germany, right? Because the East Germans take a lot of care in this tournament. It's a big deal that they're there, but getting past the group stage, getting results is important, and getting butts in the seats are important. But the problem is, it's still East Germany. Defection, more about that in a little bit. That's kind of a real worry. So like Joe Schmo or Carl the Carpenter from Leipzig or something, he just can't go to West Germany to go see the national team. Fans do show up, and they show up in numbers, but they're vetted by the state. They're vetted by the secret police, the Stasi, and only people with exquisite socialist biographies. So, for example, some people were turned away from getting tickets because their uncle was a Nazi or something. It's something like that. You had to have a clean record, were awarded tickets. But these very carefully vetted East German fans do show up to these matches, and they take over half the stadium in Hamburg. Like, it is a almost even 50-50 split. And the West German FA actually complained to the West German government, how can you allow this to happen? But the West German government was like, no, this is actually part of Ostpolitik. Let the East Germans show up. It's a sign of reconciliation. It's a sign of, detente. Let's just chill. The match, and again, this is the West Germans are going to win this tournament. And indeed, this match, I would argue, is the turning point because they totally changed their tactics after this match. West Germany's Golden Generation versus East Germany's. The match is tight. It's 0-0 at half. Uh, and then the 77th minute, Spanswer, the Spanswer, the East German midfielder, gets onto a cross and puts the ball in the back of the net. And East Germany win 1-0. And they win the group. They top the group on 5 points, which means in theory they're going to get an easier second group, but we'll talk about that. And West Germany finished second on 4 and technically have to play a harder group. Now, what happens in the second group stage rounds? Well, we know what happens with the West Germans. They switch up tactics. They have a major rethink, and they're unstoppable. Beckenbauer is really this is the birth of Beckenbauer as the pure sweeper. Right, because the East Germans were getting in on West Germany's backline way too easy in that match. And there were warning signs too against Chile, from what I understand. You would figure by winning the group, the East Germans would get an easier group in the second, stage. You would be wrong. They are grouped with Argentina, Brazil, and the Jan Cruyff Netherlands. Runners up, Jan Cruyff Netherlands. Uh, but they hold their own, though. They lose to Brazil 1-0 in a really competitive match. They lose 2-0 to the Dutch. And to be honest, that the scoreline actually flatters the Dutch because it was a way tighter. That game did not get out of hand until the last 10 minutes. And then they draw 1-1 to Argentina. So the East Germans go home, the West Germans win. But in a very real way, this tournament is, in a way, it's sort of a victory for East Germany. And it's certainly a victory for the regime because it can say, haha, we we beat the world champions in their house. We're our Germany is the better Germany, quote unquote. In 1976, these Germans again barely missed the Euros. If it was an expanded field, it was just 16 teams, they would have qualified. And to be honest, they would have been they probably would have been a dark horse. But 1976 is also the high watermark for this East German golden generation because they go to the Olympics again in Montreal and they break through. They get the gold medal and they smoke a really good Poland team 3-1 in the final. A Poland team that had, Casimir Diana, Gregor Lato, Poland's gold. They beat Poland's golden generation. 1976 is the definitively high watermark because what happens next really represents the sort of dark days of East German football, which they only really kind of recover from at the bitter end. And it's obviously too late because things above and beyond sport happen. What are these dark days? Well, the chief of the Stasi, secret police, a fellow by the name of Erich Milke, is a degenerate sports fan. East Germany did not have a hockey league, but he spent time in the Soviet Union, so he became a big hockey fan. So the Dynamo Sports Club, the Berlin section, so out of Berlin, Dynamo Berlin, has a hockey team which plays nobody, but they have one because this guy loves hockey, and they are the champions of East Germany, a non-existing league for like decades. He's also a big soccer fan. He's a big football fan. And he's really pissed off that these other East German clubs, Magdeburg, Karl Zeiss Siena, to a degree Lokomotiv Leipzig, and particularly another branch of the Dynamo Sports Society, Dynamo Dresden, is really jealous of, are the flag bearers of East German football. If you look at that German national team that played in '74, it's almost entirely drawn from players from Dynamo Dresden and Magdeburg. There's only one guy from the Dynamo club in the capital, Berlin, Milka's club. Milk is pissed. And not only is he in charge of the secret police, he's the president of the Dynamo Berlin Sporting Academy. So by the mid '70s, what does he do? Well, he transforms the Oberliga, which was flourishing, it was having its period of largest success, into a farmers league, right? Uh, into a full-on farmers league. How does he do this? Well, there's a lot that's been made about this. There wasn't actual match fixing, but there was a lot of intimidation, right? And if referees wanted to ref big matches and potentially ref international matches, it was a good idea to keep the secret police happy. So calls would tend to go Dynamo Berlin's way. But you're probably saying, like, well, what does that matter if they don't really have good players? Mickey wouldn't just intimidate the refs. He would intimidate the other clubs and their structures. And pretty much beginning in the mid '70s and definitely by the early '80s, the rest of the Oberliga is one giant farm team for Dynamo Berlin. This is why Dynamo Berlin is the team everyone hates to this day. Intimidation, forced transfers. Between 1978, '79, and 1987, 1988, Dynamo Berlin win 10 Oberliga championships in a row, and they win the Pokal, the domestic cup, 7 times. This is an era of absolute, besides the fact that it's become a farmers league, which, by the way, this is maybe part of the moral of the story. If you have a authoritarian socialist regime, never make the head of your secret police a soccer fan, or make sure that the head of your secret police is not a soccer fan, because he will fuck your league table up. Beria did the same thing in the Soviet League in the late '40s with Dynamo Moscow, and Milka did it in East Germany. So, moral of the story, if you are an authoritarian socialist state, make sure the head of your secret police, if you value the health of your football, make certain that the guy who's in charge of the coercive power of the state is not a football fan. Make sure he does not care. This is a period of stagnation. You had this blossoming golden generation, and then you have these 10 years where effectively nothing happens. And it's not just stagnation on the pitch, that liberalization that I talked about that comes in with when Honecker first comes in. By the late '70s, most of that's reversed. And, it is sort of neo-Stalinism, uh, and police oppression. And the Stasi, really, as we know it, the Stasi that's literally spying on everybody, including itself, comes into play. Repression's back. And, right, you get defections, and you get defections by footballers. In 1974, the East Germans send a team to West Germany. Nobody defects. Now, whether that was because of intimidation, but when asked, those players say no. The defection never occurred to us. We were doing just fine. By the early '80s, with oppression back, with the economy tanking, right? Because the East German economy and a lot of these economies in Eastern Europe's hitched their wagons in the late '60s and the early '70s to the Western economies through loans. Well, then you get the global recession of the late '70s and the early '80s, and Western economies aren't doing well. But these economies, like in Poland and Hungary and East Germany, that have been fueled easily by easy accessible lines of Western credit, look, they're screwed. They're hit even harder, right? And the creditors are like, you got to pay up now. And I should do what Romania did and pay up, but then you don't have an economy for 3 years, which literally was what happened. Or, in the case of the East Germans, are like, oh, well, can we take out another loan to pay off the loan? So the economies are a mess. This is a lot of the stereotypes we get about, the Iron Curtain. It's not really so much the 60s and the 70s. It's the 80s. Those are the long lines. Those are the lack of consumer goods. And in the case of East Germany, it's a very real return of oppression, uh, partially because what is going on right next door in Poland with Solidarity, but also too because, by the late 70s, the secret police are back in ascent. Honecker reverts to like an old conservative guy, and he's like, we have gone too far. You cannot have nudity in your movies. And, punk rockers, if you listen to, Black Sabbath or, the Dictators or something, you're an antisocial. Uh, so you have it's complete stagnation. And yes, you're starting to see footballers defect. Two of them in particular, Dieter Stegel and Folke Gotz, they get called up on international duty. They play, a match. I think it's a Euro Euro qualifying match in Austria, and they don't show up back to their hotel. They book to the West German embassy and say, "Hey, we got to get the hell out of here." So, needless to say, East German football's in trouble, and East Germany's in trouble. But it's weird. By the late '80s, something happens. The stranglehold of Dynamo Berlin starts to break, and it breaks because the other clubs, after a decade of abuse, intimidation, kind of say, yo, hell with this. And they petition not just the FA, but also, the German government and milk his superiors and say, look, this has to stop. If you want, the national team, if you want the league to prosper, you can't have, a one man, one club dictatorship because this is ruining the sport. And in particular, the presidents of Dynamo Dresden. So the president of the Dynamo Society, a sort of satellite club in Dresden, which was the root cause of Minka's like, how dare they in the first place, and Hansa Rostock kind of really forced the issue. And you start to see at these clubs the emergence of a sort of what could have been a second East German golden generation. I'll throw out some names you guys probably are aware of, but that you don't associate with East Germany. Forwards, Andreas Thom, Ulf Christian, and this midfield will be sick. Matthias Sammer, Thomas Dahl, and Darius Wolz. This was the East German national team in the late 80s, and they were primarily playing for either Hansa or for Dynamo Dresden. That finally break through at the end of the 80s because even the regime was like, we can't allow this to happen. In 1988, this new golden generation, right? Because after 76, it's all downhill for the national team. They finished third, I think, once or twice in qualification, but they're never a serious threat. They barely missed the Euros. They finished second, but they finished second in a group that had the Soviet Union. And this is an excellent Soviet team, by the way. Uh, who qualified, but also a group that included Michel Platini's France. They're back because, the league is finally no longer in this, it's not being monopolized anymore. But just as all this is happening, everything comes crashing down. You have the events of 1989, 1990, where the wall comes down, and within a year, the East German state itself no longer exists. But the thing is, while these momentous events are occurring, there's qualification for the World Cup and the Euros. So East Germany doesn't uh, qualify for the 1990 World Cup, which would have been weird because just a couple months after that tournament wrapped up, a tournament won by West Germany, by the way. There is no East Germany, right? They again, and they barely miss. They come very close, and because the draw for the 1992 Euros has already been made, technically a country that's not going to exist for very much longer has to show up and play some weird qualifying matches. They're drawn into a group that included, weirdly enough, West Germany, which is what they're going to be absorbed into, and Belgium. And their last game, their last match is effectively a friendly against Belgium in September 1990. There was going to be a secondary friendly where East Germany and West Germany played each other right before unification as a kind of show of unity. But there were some really ugly riots in parts of East Germany amongst East German club hooligans. And so the German FA said, no, there's a bad idea, and that match never happened. So it's that match in September 1990 that is East Germany's last hurrah. I'll talk a little bit about the issues in regards to East German football in a second. But I want to flash forward 4 years to a tournament that I remember. This is the first Euros I remember. I didn't see much of it because in the United States, this was exiled to either Telemundo or if you were lucky, you had ESPN2 and you got some of the matches in English. A tournament where Germany won. Remember those names I just mentioned before? Christian, Sammer, Doll. A fair component of the starting 11 of that German team were East German internationals, or started out as East German internationals. Particularly Sammer. He's the player of the tournament, and I believe he's the Ballon d'Or winner that year, if I'm not mistaken. So, here's a guy who was an East German international, winning the Ballon d'Or and being the best player on the pitch for United Germany in a major international tournament. East German fingerprints, even though East Germany's long gone, are all over that 96 Germany team. And indeed, in Euro 2000, arguably the most talented player from the former East to then play in the West. Well, I guess this could be disputed, but a guy who at least came up through the East German youth academy systems. Michael Ballack shows up, and Michael Ballack got his start at a little club called FC Karl Marxstadt, right where he played youth football and began his professional career. He was the last sort of byproduct of the old East German football system, and he is really the last because if you look at the German national team that's going to be playing at the Euros in a little over a month, there's only two. And up until about a year or so ago, there probably wouldn't have been any players from what was old East Germany. Tony Kroos, who may be the best former East German to have played for United Germany, but unlike Ballack, who actually came through the East German system, the state had collapsed already by the time Kroos came up. And Robert Aldrich, formerly of Union Berlin, former Oberliga club, more about them in a second, They're the only two from the East. Well, why? Well, if you look at German football, and if you've ever been to Germany, this is Bible will smack you in the face. You have a country that has technically been united for over 30 years, but in many real ways is are still two very separate countries. Uh, and indeed, you have the financial repercussions. And in the case of East Germany, or what was East Germany, it's a little less staggering as it was, let's say, in Poland or Slovakia, or what would become the former Soviet Union, like Ukraine or Lithuania. But neoliberal capitalism did not. The transition wasn't great. And right, you have a serious unequal distribution of wealth within Germany. If you compare, salaries and incomes between people who lived in West Germany, in what was West Germany versus East, it's staggering. It's staggering. There's a massive gap. It's also in terms of high finance. If you look at, Germany's major corporations, something like 87 or 88% of them are based and are mainly centered in what was West Germany. East Germany is like barren. And a lot of these big socialist industries that employed a lot of these people that aren't making a lot of money now, like big steel mills in Dresden, etc., they're closed because they're bought out by Western companies, and in many cases they're outsourced. They're outsourced to Poland, they're outsourced to Latin America, etc. Turkey. This hits East German clubs or clubs that used to play in East Germany were invited into the Bundesliga and the West Germans, pyramid. It hits it pretty hard. Uh, the reason that you get these two East German golden generations is on the back of the youth academies. The youth academies at places like Dynamo Dresden, Hansa Rostock, Karl Marx Stadt, Chemie Leipzig. These are some of the best youth academies in Europe. By the late 90s, early aughts, they are dead, and in many cases, they have closed. Indeed, the Karl Marxstadt, the academy that birthed Michael Ballack, no longer exists. The club still exists, but the youth academy is gone. And there's also, dare I say, a talent drain, right? And those of you who are fans of, know anything about the German national team that won in 2014, etc., this isn't just an East versus West thing. Poland, where if anything, this transition was harder. Think about all those Polish guys that were playing for Germany. Well, why are they there? Because their parents had to leave Poland and they were, sell their labor someplace else because it was not good. So there is this kind of like post-colonial or colonial relationship between Germany and not just its immediate neighbors in the East, but what was the Germany of the East. So you have this talent drain. So it's not like good footballers aren't born in what was East Germany. A lot of them leave and, by the age of, 11, 12, are in youth academies in the West because this is where they have money. It's that simple. And right, it's it's been tough and the system itself is sort of tough. There is this sort of cultural colonization too. Like it's cool to make fun of East Germans, Aussies on German late night TV, right? Because the dominant narrative is the Western narrative, right? And East Germans are usually portrayed as like rednecks and yokels and primitive Neanderthal people who are all neo Nazis, stuff like that, stereotypes like that. It also has taken a shape in terms of football. Like, it's not just, oh, the money and the resources are in the West. It's like, why would you want to pursue your career in the East, where the majority of the historic clubs are literally, if you're interested in East German football and what it was like, watch. I actually watched some of this. Watch the Re, Re, Regionalliga Nordost because it's literally the old East German Oberliga. But that's the fourth tier of German football. And unlike the other regional leagues, there's no automatic promotion from the Northeast League into Bundesliga 3. There isn't. You have to play a West German team in a playoff. I'm sorry, that's fucked up. Why does the Bavarian clubs just go right in, but these clubs don't? Why is that? But things are not all doom and gloom. Tony Cruz and Robert Aldrich will be at the Euros. There will be matches being played at the Euros in Leipzig in the Red Bull Arena. And look, love them, hate them. The fact that RB Leipzig, Rasa ball, long ball, yeah, right, exists, that's a sign. The fact that Red Bull has come into what was East Germany, which was barren, it was the deadlands of football in Germany, and their imprint and their investment, again, love it or hate it, it's going to bear fruit. Local kids from Leipzig and the surrounding areas in Saxony are going to be going through that youth academy. They're probably going to get sold, because this is what RB does, to someone else, and they're going to be on the national team. For more established East German clubs, there's also a model of, potential success or salvation. Yeah, things didn't go right this season. European football was not good. But look at Union Berlin. Union Berlin was able to, through smart signings, the development of not just local talent, but also quote unquote cheaper foreign talent, get themselves into the Bundesliga. And we'll see what happens because their future in the Bundesliga is very much, in question. As of recording, there's one more match day left in the season. But look, they not only got to the Bundesliga, they got European football. And if you look at the third league, some traditional East German clubs are sitting there, and if they play their cards right, could potentially be sort of sleeping giants. It's not all doom and gloom. It's really hard because systemically, institutionally, there's so many things above and beyond your control that's against you. But it's possible that we see a resurgence of, quote unquote, Aussie football. And I think it's important to remember where this potential, third, quote unquote, third golden generation, if it exists, or this resurgence of football in this part of the country, it's important to understand the story of where that came from, right? Because that's the other sort of screwed up thing that occurred after reunification. It's the West German narrative became the meta narrative. And the East German narrative, which was 40 years of separate, not just history, but a football sport, got erased. It's and in that regard, it is colonial. It is like Israelis calling hummus or falafel theirs, which it's not. Uh, it's tough, but it is possible. And it's going to be interesting, right? Because there are going to be matches played in Leipzig. And, right, hopefully, we do see this resurgence of football in the former East because there's fans there, guys. There are fans there. They love this game. Leipzig, Dresden in particular. These are football mad towns, and they do sort of deserve better. But again, we'll see. Anyway, gang, Wow. This is Professor Matt, and this is the first of, again, like I said, several of these historical based shows. My hope is to get the next one out. Well, hopefully we'll get it out sometime in the next couple weeks. It is going to be completely dedicated to Georgian football, and that's right, not just since Georgian independence, but Georgian football in the Soviet era. So we'll talk a little Dynamo Tbilisi, etc. And yeah, looking forward to it. Anyway, gang, you guys know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. Be good, my friends. Auf Wiedersehen.